A very common experience is trying to do a Bible in a year, right? You start out at the beginning of Genesis, you go through to the end of Revelation, you read a few chapters of Scripture every single day, and then eventually you finish the entire canon of sacred Scripture. And a very common experience is that you get through Genesis, there's a lot of exciting stuff, creation of the world, you get a lot of stories there. You go into Exodus, you begin Exodus, and Exodus, there's some interesting stuff there, right? There's the plagues, Pharaoh, and everything like that. But by the time you get to the end of Exodus, you begin to get to things that aren't as interesting, and a lot of things become very complicated. If you're new to sacred scripture, or even if you've read sacred scripture a few times, if you've read these sections a few times, often you dread actually getting to the end of Exodus, where you're looking at the creation of the tabernacle, and you're looking at the sacrificial system in Leviticus. This part of sacred scripture ends up being the death for a lot of people who are doing things like a Bible in a year. But actually, this is some of the most important sections in sacred scripture. Really, one is not going to be able to understand the entirety of the Gospels. One is not going to be able to understand the entirety of the economy of salvation unless they understand the end of Exodus and Leviticus, right? Where a lot of the sacrificial system is outlined. And really, it took me forever to be able to actually realize this and to be able to actually understand what was going on in most of the Pentateuch, right? You read through Genesis, and if you read through with a very astute lens, you read through understanding the way in which literature works, you understand repetition, you understand the ways in which comparison happens, you're really easily able to understand what the significance of a lot of what Genesis is getting at, right? With just a little bit of help, you're able to get through it. But really, when you're going and looking through Exodus, you're going and looking through Leviticus, it becomes a lot more difficult, right? And there's not that many resources out there actually explaining, this is what the different portions of the tabernacle mean, and this is why it's important in the New Testament. These are what the different sacrifices mean, and this is why it's important in the New Testament. These are the different feast days in the Old Testament. This is why they're important in the New Testament. There's not really a lot of people out there doing this, explaining. And interestingly, the place in which I first found a very succinct and systematic explanation of all of these things, and I think a very full explanation of all of these, it wasn't in a modern author. It really wasn't even in the Church Fathers, although they have a lot of very awesome stuff to say. But really, the place where I found a succinct and systematic and full explanation of these things was actually in St. Thomas, right? And a lot of people would be shocked by that. Some of you listening here have probably heard me go on and on and on about how much I appreciate St. Thomas's Pauline commentaries, for example, or even his commentaries in the Gospels, right? He wrote a commentary on Matthew, wrote a commentary on John. These things are very important. These things are awesome. You probably even heard me reference the commentary on the Psalms, or maybe the commentary on Jeremiah or Isaiah or Job, right? These things are very important. But St. Thomas, you may be wondering, he didn't write a commentary on the Pentateuch. Didn't write a commentary on Genesis. He didn't write a commentary on the ceremonial law. Well, you think that he didn't write a commentary on these things. And it's very hard to find where the commentary is, right? He actually did write a commentary, kind of a commentary on Genesis, right? He wrote a commentary on the first few chapters. This is found in Prima Pars of his Summa, where he goes over creation. He goes over the 7 days of creation and explains in a lot of detail what was going on in the 7 days of creation. That is a commentary, right? Even if it's in scholastic form, it's still a commentary. And he wrote a commentary on the entirety of the Old Law in a very interesting place, right? In his, what's called his Tractatus de Legibus. And this is found in the second part of his Summa, where he goes over the nature of law. A lot of people, when they think about St. Thomas on law, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about natural law, right? Or maybe they even think about some of what he wrote on morals. That's probably what they're thinking of. But really, I find his most important contribution, some of his most astute insights, and his best systematizing of the tradition to be actually found in the section on the Old Law. He covers the natural law, right? He covers the new law. He covers the how the New Testament works and the different precepts of the New Testament and counsels and commands and stuff like that. But then he has a section right in the middle of there on the Old Law. And he's discussing a lot of things when it comes to the Old Law, but he gives the famous division of the Old Law into moral, judicial, ceremonial. This is very important for any reader of the Old Testament. If you don't have that first distinction in your mind there between the three types of precepts in the Old Law, you're going to get very confused, right? Because with the moral law, right, these are general precepts that are going to be binding in all places at all times. If it says, for example, in the Ten Commandments, says, do not commit adultery. It says, do not steal. It says, honor your father and mother. All of these things, these are not different precepts that are only applicable for Israel. It's applicable for everybody at all times in all places. So when you're reading the ceremonial precepts of the moral precepts of the Old Law, actually in the church's very catechesis, you can look at the Catechism of Trent, you can look at the New Catechism of the Catholic Church, you can look at the catecheses written by St. Thomas, or really by almost any author. You'll see when they're discussing morals, when they're discussing the law of charity, they're really going over the Ten Commandments. They're explaining the Ten Commandments. You do it with your examination of conscience every time you go to confession. So the moral law, this is extremely, extremely important and needs to be read, right, and reflected upon. But everybody already knows that.